Welcome, everyone. Lucas here. Today's show is called Harness the Voice in Your Head. And I am joined here with Ethan Kross. Ethan Kross is a doctor of psychology. His work is focused on controlling the conscious mind. He founded the Emotion and Self-Control Laboratory in 2008. His work's been published in Science, the New England Journal of Medicine, and a whole bunch of other peer-reviewed journals, among others. He has a book. It's called Chatter, The Voice in Our Head, Why It Matters, and How to Harness It. We'll be chatting about this today. You can find more about Ethan, his writing, his research, and his work at his website, which is his full name, Ethan Kross, with a K, ethankross.com. Ethan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Lucas. Excited to be here.
I think all of us struggle with our own selves, our emotions and our tendencies and our cravings and our dysfunctions. And I always just try to think of like, why is this happening? So from like an evolutionary perspective, the voice in our head, the chatter in our head from, your studies and your research, and from a science perspective, is that inner voice adaptive, maladaptive? Does it just depend on the scenario?
On the whole, I'd say it's an incredibly valuable tool. It's interesting because I think for many people, we often experience this voice in our head as maladaptive, when it morphs into what I call chatter, which is really this dark side of the inner voice, when we end up worrying and ruminating and catastrophizing, getting stuck in those negative thought loops. But the inner voice serves a number of really valuable functions. So if you're not consumed with chatter, you can use your inner voice to do lots of things like everything from keep a nugget of information active in your head. So if I were to ask you to just memorize a phone number or repeat a phrase in your head, or while you're walking down the aisle in a grocery store to just remember, hey, what do I have to buy? You'd repeat things in your head using language. You might think yogurt, eggs, cheese. That's using your inner voice. We use our inner voice to simulate and plan. Like before a presentation, I'll go over what I'm going to say. We use our inner voice to control ourselves. When I'm exercising, I will often count down how many reps are left in a set. If I'm exercising in a class and an instructor is telling me to do painful things, I may say things to myself about that instructor in my head, right? That's using my inner voice to control myself, to coach myself along. And we use our inner voice to create stories that help us understand our experiences in this messy world. We experience adversity, we turn our attention inward, and we try to understand, well, why did we get rejected? Why did this happen to us? And use your inner voice to do that too. So your inner voice is this remarkable tool. You would not want to live life without it. The problem is that sometimes we wield this tool ineffectively. And when that happens, it turns into chatter, and chatter is a huge problem. And so the real challenge we face is, how do we learn how to use this tool of the mind, our inner voice, more effectively? And that's what I've spent my career studying, and that's what the book is all about.
Kind of a strange question for you, but I feel like sometimes politicians and celebrities and musicians, they're really good at kind of leveraging our inner voice by creating these mantras or these sayings that kind of echo, and they might be positive, or at least positive sounding, or they might be negative, or they might just be confusing. And that could be anything from trust the science to make America great again to do your part, any of these. And please, listeners, I'm apolitical. It's not, please don't take that as any kind of affirmation of anything. I don't want your hate mail, but I get really, I'm really thinking about this a lot, because you see these things amplified like never before, at least never before in my lifetime, where these phrases, it's almost predictable what people are going to say in different settings. And that shows up in hashtags, it shows up in memes, these saying after saying after saying. And it almost feels like the inner voice has now been broadcast and published publicly, that same kind of chatter. And it makes me think of, like when you're a kid, don't talk to strangers, don't talk to strangers. I remember being in downtown Minneapolis, 5 years old, and a stranger came to me and I heard my mother's voice. I hear this same kind of nonsense chatter coming from both sides of the aisle, coming from environmentalists, coming from environmental deniers, all of the above. It feels like they're trying to tap into my inner voice. Am I stretching there? Do you think there's a
no? You're not stretching at all. I mean, and you're instead speaking to what is so fascinating about this topic. And so a lot of us think of our inner voice as this incredibly private experience, which it is much of the time. It's not like we go around at parties and when we used to go to parties and, hey, what's your inner voice saying to you right now? Like, we don't tend to ask those questions. But interestingly enough, something has changed recently in society. It happened around 15 or 16 years ago with the proliferation of social media, where now we do ask people those questions. If you actually
Mm.
log on to Facebook, the phrase that you see, I think this is still the case, is what is on your mind? It's
Yeah.
a platform is essentially beckoning us to share the thoughts streaming through our head, to
Mm.
share our inner voice. And it turns out when you do that, sometimes that can be helpful and sometimes it can be really harmful,
Yeah.
because we now have these giant megaphones for broadcasting our inner voice for others to consume. Um, and so that has just given scientists like myself this whole new dimension to study. One of the things we know about our inner voice is that when you're experiencing strong negative emotions that tend to characterize the experience of chatter, anxiety, anger, sadness, frustration, we're often really motivated to share those feelings with other people. And we're,
Mm.
we're motivated to share those feelings, to talk about them, both because we have these social and emotional needs. We want to connect with others, empathize, have our experiences be validated, but we also want to talk to other people so they can help us reframe how we think about our circumstances.
Mm.
Now, something really interesting happens when you go from doing that talking to other people thing in the physical world versus the social media world. In the physical world, when an emotion is triggered, that's when it's heightened. You're so upset, you're so anxious. You need to first find someone to actually talk to. And that's not always straightforward. Sometimes, like it
Right.
takes a while to find someone, call them
Yeah.
up. They're not always available. And when you're trying to find someone, time passes. And we know that time helps titrate, temper our emotional responses. So by the time you talk to them, you're often a little bit more cooled down. Then
Mm.
when you start talking to them, you're getting all this feedback when you do so. So, like right now, you and I can see each other. As I'm saying things, I'm getting information from your face, all these different empathy cues, rich sources of information you're giving me that's telling me whether I'm talking too quick, too slow, being
Mm.
offensive, not funny, and so forth. Now think of the smartphone digitized world, right? The moment our emotions are triggered, we've got a device that is the equivalent of a megaphone that we can use to tap into our network and release the emotion without any of that feedback, right? Right when our emotions are peaking. And I think this is why you get phenomena like cyberbullying and trolling happening, which are not good. So technology is changing all of this in a pretty
Yeah.
dramatic way, how we relate to our inner voice. And our inner voice is tuned to what is happening around us, including what politicians and cultural leaders say to us. And so I think your intuitions about this are exactly right.
In my world, people are into meditation and mindfulness and this kind of thing. And I've done a whole bunch of work, silent retreats, 12 days, staring at the ground, sitting in a dark room. And I'm not really convinced that I feel like I'm making progress, but I'm not really sure. Is there, from a scientific perspective, is there any indication that your chatter is less or worse than my chatter? Sometimes we meet someone, like you said, who's in an emotional state where they're spun out, their life's fallen apart, their marriage is on the rocks, or they lost their job or whatever it is. And they're clearly spun out. But is there anything really to indicate that someone can be more in control of their chatter than another? Or are we all just big bunks of junk and maybe one feels slightly better than the other less?
Oh, I think there's a lot of room for intervening and lots and lots of tools that can be brought to bear. I mean, I say this based on the scientific literature. I say this also based on personal experience. I think I've gotten much better at managing chatter,
Mm.
knowing about the tools that are out there. You mentioned that you've had a lot of experience with meditation and these silent retreats, and you're not sure what impact they're having on you. We do know that meditation can be very effective for some people, but one of the themes of my work and my book is that there are no single one size fits all solutions.
Mm.
And actually, I think that's one of the places where attempts to popularize some of the some Eastern contemplative practices like meditation sometimes run awry. And I should say I'm very pro meditation. I've been
Yeah.
meditating since I'm 5 years old. I got
Mm.
my mantra, transcendental meditation mantra at that point. I do yoga. I love all that stuff, and it's useful for me. But I've spoken to lots of people who don't find meditation useful when it comes to their chatter. And my answer to those people is if you don't find it useful, that's okay, because there are over 24 other things that you can do to manage your chatter.
Yeah.
And I think what science has done a pretty good job of doing is identifying individual tools that work. But what we have not yet done is figure out, okay, Lucas, for the problems you're experiencing, these are the three things I want you to do. And they're different from the four that I tend to do. We don't have that level of personalized chatter
Yeah.
support yet. But that is something that folks can do, start self-experimenting on their own. So try out the different tools, see what works for you, and you find something, stick with it. And if it doesn't work, don't do it.
Ethan, I think one of the problems is the things that consistently work for people is like a bottle of red wine, a couple of pills, a pint of Haagen-Dazs, binge watching Netflix till 4 a.m. That stuff works. You know what I mean? It really calms the chatter. And so, um, with the access to this kind of stuff, and now cannabis is legal most places. I mean, I'm pro legalization, but I'm also aware of the fact that like that turns off the chatter. You know what I mean? What do you think about this tendency to lean into negative? Well, I shouldn't say negative, potentially negative tools.
Well, I think the reason they're often considered negative tools, and not all of the ones you listed would be considered negative, but certainly like um, binge drinking
Yeah,
would, is because they work really well in the short term,
yeah,
um, but it's kind of like going to a movie to get your mind off a problem.
mm,
And if it's a great movie and you're engaged, you'll forget about the chatter. But then you get out of the movie theater and you see the text messages on your phone and the chatter returns. And so a lot of those kinds of what we might call escapist tactics, they're useful in the short term, but they don't really nip the chatter in the bud long term. And they can also obviously, as listeners will know, create some dependency issues that are problematic. Now, this is not to say that you should never have a glass of red wine or anything like that.
yeah,
But do I think that there are healthier tools that people can use? Absolutely. Actually, let me tell you about some research that we have. It's
mm,
unpublished. We did a very large study to look at, hey, what are the different tools that help people deal with their anxiety surrounding COVID-19? And so
mm,
we did this massive study. We tracked people for 2 weeks, a nationally representative sample across the US. And every day we gave people a list of healthy and unhealthy tools. And unhealthy tools would be things like drinking or venting about your emotions. On the healthier end of the spectrum are things like exercising,
yeah,
putting your experiences in perspective, getting good support. What we found was that people who use the healthiest combinations of tools compared to those who use like the unhealthiest combinations, people who are drinking and venting, the healthy people, the people who use the healthy tools, they experienced 30% lower daily levels of anxiety. So I do think there's a lot more that you can gain from going the healthy as opposed to the unhealthy route. Maybe a little bit more difficult, but that's not necessarily um, a reason to not try it.
for a lot of people, the inner voice, the inner chatter, the inner critic, the whatever negative spiral is looping, a lot of it's sometimes coming from people in their life, a significant other, an in-law, boss, maybe it's a neighborhood, a living situation, an objectively difficult situation through a fault of their own or no fault of their own or through a bad choice they made 7 years ago. How do people begin to unravel that? I meet so many people and they tell me they're depressed, they're anxious, and they tell me what's going on. And I said, that seems like a totally, totally appropriate response to what's going on in your life. I think I would be, times five. It's people are really managing a lot and trying their best. What kind of tools can people like that leverage if they're just constantly in a situation, let's say on a daily basis with another human being or an environment, whether that's a work or home environment, that is just objectively toxic, that's going to keep that chatter, why me, made a bad choice, married the wrong guys, took the wrong job, didn't sort out my finances, should have stopped drinking earlier. How can they at least attempt to break free from that? When I guess what happens, people lose agency, right? They need the job to pay the bills. They need the partner to pay the rent or whatever it might be.
Well, I mean, I think the bleak situation that you're describing is one where a person is forced to continually be exposed to a source of chatter,
Mm,
and it's not something that the person there are we'd really want to get into the situation to understand it, right? So is this a case where the other person is truly toxic?
Hmm.
You have no role in creating that chatter, and there's nothing you can do to make the situation better. If you can't, then one piece of advice would be to try to change that situation somehow. And there's almost always ways of changing the situation. I, in my experiences, those are pretty rare cases, but when they exist, I think you do want to consider taking significant courses of action. Like if a job or a person is literally making you sick, then that's good reason to consider whether there are alternatives. And when I say literally making you sick, we know that chatter can have negative physical health effects. It predicts things like problems of cardiovascular disease, certain forms of cancer and inflammation. So the stakes are pretty high here. Now, if we move outside of that, extreme instance of being with a toxic personality or environment, but rather moving into the space that I think so many listeners, and certainly me, I would imagine yourself too, occupy, which is like, hey, life throws curveballs at us sometimes, maybe often. And sometimes we experience chatter, and sometimes it's more extreme than others. What do you do in those instances? Um, there are lots of things you can do. And I like to break it down as there are three categories of tools. There are things you could do on your own. There are people tools,
Hmm.
our relationships that can be harnessed, and then environmental tools. So tools in our actual physical environments. I won't go through all 26 of them because we need a lot of time, but I'll just give you a couple of examples of those tools that fall in those different buckets. Things you could do on your own. What happens when you experience chatter is we zoom in really narrowly on the situation, right? To the exclusion of lots of other things happening in our lives and lots of alternative ways of making sense of our circumstances. And one category of tools that can be really useful there are what we call distancing tools, ways of stepping back to look at your circumstances from a more objective standpoint. And there are lots and lots of different ways that people can distance, ranging from changing the words they use to coach themselves through a problem. So use your own name and the second person pronoun you to give yourself advice. Call
Hmm.
that distance self-talk. That can
Interesting.
be a useful tool. You could do something called temporal distancing. Think about how you're going to feel about the situation you're struggling with a month from now or a year from now. Most of the things we're dealing with fade over time in terms of
Hmm.
their emotional impact. If you're visualizing a really ruminative past experience, try to see yourself in that, adopt what we call a fly on the wall perspective. See yourself in the event and try to think about it from that more detached perspective. Those are just a few distancing tools. There are many more out there. Another thing you could do on your own, perform a ritual,
Hmm.
a rigid sequence of behaviors that is infused with meaning. Your culture gives you lots of rituals, but many people
Sure.
create their own. I've got a Saturday morning ritual that gives me much inner peace. I wake up, I exercise, I go to the farmer's market, make breakfast for my kids. That's a sequence of behaviors that is infused with meaning and has some chatter redemptive features. Um, so those are some things you can do on your own. For other people, one thing that I think not everyone is aware of is that just expressing your emotions and venting actually doesn't help us deal with our emotions. It
It
can make
doesn't
them
help.
worse. It
Oh,
does
wow.
not help.
Huh.
It does not help. And what's I think it's an important finding to talk about because
Hmm.
um, many people think it does help, right? The idea that venting our emotions is useful is
Yeah.
incredibly popular in our culture. What happens when you vent is you feel really good about your relationship with the person you're talking to. So let's say you and I are buddies now. I call you up with a problem. You just like get me to talk.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that sounds terrible. Oh my God, that's happened to me. That makes me feel really good about our connection. It's
Yeah.
nice to know that you're there to care for me. But if all we do is ping pong back and forth like that about the negativity, I leave the conversation just as upset as when I started.
Hmm.
So the best kinds of conversations are conversations that do two things. The person you're talking to does take some time to listen to what you're going through, does let you express your emotions a little bit, but then they help broaden your perspective. They help try to work with you to help you reframe how you're thinking about this issue to ultimately allow you to move on past the chatter. That's what makes someone a really good chatter advisor. And I think being really deliberate about who you talk to about your problems has the potential to do a lot of good. There are a lot of people in my life that I'm super close to. I love them. I'm related to them sometimes. I
Mm.
don't talk to them about my chatter because I know
Yeah.
they're not going to help me, not because they don't want to help me, but they just think that the way to help is to get me to talk and just talk. And there's a lot of research that says that that doesn't actually help. So that's one way of harnessing your relationship with other people. There are lots of other little
Yeah.
things you could do there too. Um, just one example from the last bucket of environmental tools. Um, seek out experiences of awe, which is
Mm.
this emotion we experience when we're in the presence of something vast and indescribable, like an
Yeah.
amazing mountain view or a sunset, or even looking up at a skyscraper. Like I'm filled with awe when I look at feats of innovation.
Yeah.
When we feel awe, what happens is we experience something that we call shrinking of the self. We feel smaller when we're contemplating something vast and indescribable. And when we feel
Mm.
smaller, so does our chatter. And so that's one of my
Interesting.
favorite environmental tools
Yeah.
that people can use too.
That's great. I think about that a lot. I live here in Barcelona, and it's just so beautiful, and it never escapes me. And I grew up in the US, and I grew up, I spent a lot of time in New York City, and I thought New York City was really beautiful. I was living in, pretty rough part of Brooklyn, and it was really
What
just,
part?
well, I was in Williamsburg, but this is 20 years ago.
Hmm.
And I guess it was still hipster nation back then. But yeah, it's just a really different thing. Every single day, I'm surrounded by beauty, amazing doors, and people who spend hundreds of years building churches, and they're absolutely all over the place. And I find the same thing. It's really something that as I've gotten older and older, I've really learned that it's like a universal thing. When I was younger, I spent a lot of time in nature, in Southern California specifically. And I didn't have to learn to appreciate that. Again, like you said, there's this moment where you summit a peak, or you find a mountain stream, or whatever it is. You don't have to learn. Everybody has this moment where, again, your thoughts and your life is kind of reduced, and you're just kind of overwhelmed. And that same sort of thing happens, at least for me, with art and architecture and music, and these things that have, like, no learning curve. You just throw any random person in any random country, and they experience it, which kind of segues into my last question. I think a lot of us try to get really cerebral. At least I do. I try to think my way out of thinking. It's like, okay, great. I'm ruminating about this thing that went wrong in this relationship that spun out, and let me just come up with a 10-point plan, or read some article, or watch some YouTube video. I'm sure there's some validity to that, but what are the limitations of trying to think our way out of thinking, and at what point should people start taking action, like going on the hike, like going to the cathedral, like, how do you help people think about that?
Well, well, I think there's a reason we often try to think ourselves out of our problems, which is because I would argue that most of the time that tool actually serves us pretty well. So if we were to like actually lay out all the instances in which you try to be cerebral, my guess is that it's working out for you
It's worked
9 out of
out.
10 times, 8 out of 10 times, right? And so when you find that this approach is not working for you, that's then the cue to go to your toolbox.
Yeah.
And that toolbox is really, really rich and elaborate,
Mm.
right? So we talked about one, two, three, four, five tools. Like I talked
Yeah.
about 26 that are out there.
Mm.
It's incredibly elaborate and diverse. It's
Yeah.
not just meditation, it's all these other things. And um, I think you want to have what we call an if then plan, right? Create an technical terms, we call that an implementation intention. So if I
Okay.
find that thinking about my problems isn't helping me, then I'm going to do X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
I have one of these for like 2 a.m. chatter. I don't know if you ever wake up at 2
Yeah. Of
a.m. on
course.
occasion. It's like, oh my, here it goes again. And like the moment I wake up at 2 a.m. with the terror, it happens every month, once a month or
Mm.
so. The first thing I do is I tell myself, you're going to feel better about it in the morning. Now, it can be hard to access that tool in the middle of the night when your brain is on sleep mode. So I've made this intention to do it ahead of time, and I do it automatically. And it really, really helps me because I know that I've gone through this countless times before in my life. I've had that 2 a.m. terror, dream, or was woken up. And I
Yeah.
know I always feel better about it in the morning. I'm always
Mm.
able to adopt a broader perspective. And just reminding myself about that at 2 a.m., super helpful. So
Yeah.
really think carefully about what your triggers are, and then have a plan for trying certain tools to help you in those instances. And if those tools work for you, keep on doing it. And if not,
Yeah.
cycle through some other ones.
I think it's a great idea. I like the analogy of a toolkit. And I think, all of us have a toolkit, but it's often limited. And there's usually a couple of bad tools in there that we lean on, whether it's pills or booze or whatever it might be. And just by adding more tools, because inevitably you get in these new situations, maybe you've gotten really great at dealing with your financial anxiety, but then suddenly the fear of death and your age is, you're waking up, checking your wrinkles in the mirror or something. It's never happened to me. These kinds of things, I think, you get a new mental loop that you haven't experienced before. And it's really helpful if you have a new
Yep.
tool. And I think so many of us get in these patterns. It's a great conversation, Ethan. Tell people what you're up to this year, what you're excited about, and where they can find you and find your book.
Well, doing a lot of work talking to people about this material. We've created a curriculum for kids in school where we teach them about this information. We're going to be looking at what effect that has on their lives. And we're, of course, still elbow deep in the lab doing original research on these topics to figure out how to help people manage their chatter better. If people want to learn more, they can go to my website, www.ethankross.com. And there's information about everything we talked about here, the book, me, the lab, and so forth.
Thanks so much for coming on the show, Ethan. Let's keep in touch.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for having me.